So it was a 20-foot focal length telescope right there, and with about an 18.7-inch aperture that was a speculum mirror, which is a alloy of copper and tin, and those were used for his sweeps. And he did observe M51 4 times in 1783, both with a 6 and 12 inch, and then twice with his 18.7 inch. The telescope that's in that that you can see on the screen. And this is actually his second description. He called it very bright, large, surrounded with a beautiful glory of milky nebulosity, with here and there small interruptions, that's kind of interesting, that seem to throw the glory at a distance. Not exactly, not sure what he was exactly meaning by throwing the glory at a distance, other than extending the halo to a further distance, making it larger, perhaps with averted vision or something. Okay. And this is his first, that's another, you can see Herschel, it looks like he's riding the telescope, but he's actually on a platform next to the telescope. And actually, he's actually at the, I'm looking at the picture right here, he's using the Newtonian focus in that image, in that drawing, correct? But he eventually settled on using a front view because he did not want to lose light from the secondary. Front view means he actually had no secondary, and the mirror was slightly tilted, so the image formed right at the edge of the tube, and he put an eyepiece there and sort of stuck his head in front of the tube and observed in that position. So he described it as bright, a very uncommon object, nebulosity in the center, with a nucleus surrounded by detached nebulosity. Now it's getting more interesting. Detached nebulosity. Probably he was seeing the effect of the dust lanes in the spiral arms of M51, so it looked like there was sort of a gap between the glow where the brightness dipped and then increased again, and it dipped because of the dust lanes in the form of a circle of unequal brightness in 3 or 4 places, forming altogether a most curious object. Now, he was viewing a spiral galaxy, but he had no idea there was any structure to it, and without any preconception that what he was viewing had a certain shape, this is how he described it, which makes perfect sense. Okay. All right. This is not the same telescope. This was his final telescope, his not 20-foot, but 40-foot telescope, which was a 48-inch F10 telescope, which was funded by King George III. And it was the largest telescope in the world, I believe, for nearly 50 years. And that telescope was not his favorite telescope because it had such a long focal length, it had a very small field of view, and it took it wasn't very practical to sweep for objects with such a tiny piece of the sky in the view of the eyepiece. So he built it partly because it was funded and he then had a salary, etc. But it really did not get used much. But he did discover a couple of Saturn's moons, Enceladus, and Mimas, but even that's a little bit questionable because I've read that he suspected those moons in his 18.7 inch and basically just confirmed them in the large telescope. But apparently there's no record that he ever looked at M51 with that telescope. And just a little about his cosmology. He assumed the universe started with a widely distributed stars, which slowly condensed into large collections called stratum under the influence of gravity. And eventually these fragmented into clusters, and then the clusters condensed further into globular clusters, and finally into the most compact form, which was planetary nebula, which of course he had it all wrong, but at least he had at least a theory that he could perhaps test somehow. But in 1790, he discovered the planetary nebula NGC 1514. This is his sketch in Taurus, and that convinced him that probably wasn't the case. This just appeared to be a single star surrounded by a luminous fluid, and there was no indication of any modeling to it or unevenness. It just looked like it consisted of a gas or fluid without any stars whatsoever. So he flip-flopped and decided that there was such a thing as pure gas or luminous fluid. This is William's son, John, who discovered nearly 1,900 nebulae and clusters and continued the search from South Africa. And he observed M51 a half a dozen times. And he actually first came very close to resolving it as a spiral. He said it is a very bright nebula, 1 minute in diameter, of a resolvable kind of light with a double ring, or rather 1.5 rings, like an armillary sphere. And you'll see a sketch on the next slide. That is his actual printed sketch of M51. And this section out here, the top section, is a spiral arm, though he didn't interpret that as a spiral arm. As I said, he did make the interesting comment, supposing the ring, consists of stars, the appearance it would present to a spectator placed on a planet attendant on one of them, eccentrically situated towards the northwest quarter of the central mass. This would be about where northwest is, over here, would be exactly similar to that of the Milky Way. Now, what is he saying? He's kind of saying that this kind of looks a little bit like the Milky Way split by a dust lane. And that isn't quite, there are two spiral arms there, actually, but very interesting that he made the analogy that this object looked like the Milky Way might appear to someone who was in that system. Okay, let's go on. So after around the same time, or after Herschel sort of came back from South Africa, he stopped observing, and the largest telescopes that were in use were mostly relatively large refractors in professional observatories, a 15-inch refractor in Pulkovo and Harvard had both 15-inch refractors, and there's no record of any observation of any object described as a spiral form. Okay. So now we get to Lord Rosse, who's William Parsons, heir to a wealthy Irish peer, the third Earl of Rosse, and a talented engineer. And he built, he built in 1839 a 36-inch refractor, which looks quite a bit like the Herschel's telescope there, the same kind of stand. And there's an observer here on a platform. To me, it looks sort of like he's looking in the front end of the telescope, like Herschel observed. And he observed in 1843 M51, and his description was a great number of stars. This is with a 36-inch. Again, a speculum metal alloy mirror, which only had, at best, when it was freshly polished, 70% reflectivity. And if you had two mirrors, secondary, then those figures get multiplied. The end result is you get 50% light to the eyepiece. He described M51 as a great number of stars clearly visible, but Herschel's ring not apparent, at least no such uniformity as he represents in the drawing. Well, why is he talking about stars in M51? Because even though Herschel could not resolve stars in his 18.7-inch telescope in every single object, including planetaries, which makes sense, William Parsons felt if he built a large enough telescope, he would be able to prove that all nebulous objects, all nebulae, were actually clusters of stars. And in 1844, he observed it with two friends, Romney Robinson and James South, and he reported that they both saw the center clearly resolved, meaning like a globular cluster, like he could see stars in the center, which isn't the case at all. But that's what he expected to see. He assumed, he went to the eyepiece assuming it was a globular cluster or rich open cluster of some kind. Okay, let's go. And here's his second telescope, Lord Ross's 72-inch, 53-foot focal length telescope at Burcastle. The telescope, just like the Herschel's, is designed not to move around the sky like a Dobsonian. Yes. Oh, yeah. There's a nice, yeah, that's not a sunbow, though. It's a rainbow, just a, yeah, pretty cool. Yeah.
Upstage.
Yes. Nature has upstaged me, which that's always fine. So you can kind of get a little bit of scale on this telescope. There's some people down at the bottom, like this is the height of a person down here. And there's maybe someone in the observing platform right here. It's about this height. So unbelievable size and scale to this telescope. Okay, let's go ahead, Rich. This is just a watercolor of Lord Ross directing the movement of the great speculum, the 72-inch, into position at the base of the telescope. So the telescope tube is here, but the mirror is now, they're showing it being installed, and there's workers there. Just thought that was a pretty cool watercolor. Might have been done by Lord Ross's, I don't know if it was done by his wife or not, but let's go ahead, Rich. Okay, so first light of this 72-inch Leviathan was on February 11th, 1845. The first thing they did was observe Sirius. It's kind of interesting. You may say that is really a weird thing to observe, Sirius, but that was done basically to test the optics, to see what a really bright star would look like, whether it could come to focus, and that was still something that was commonly done with refractors. So they observed some Sirius and some nameless clusters with his friends, James South and Reverend Romney Robinson, who's over here. James South is on your left, and that's him with his pet dog, Tiger, in his lap. It looks like, if you're in the audience, it might look like he has a cat there, but it looks like there's a dog on his, right on his knee, kind of posing for the camera. Okay. So they mention Romney Robinson wrote about the experience, the Reverend Romney Robinson wrote about the experience later, and he specifically said all 43 nebula which we've examined, probably a lot of them were galaxies, have been resolved, which is ridiculous. And the central nebula of M51 is a globe of large stars. Large just means bright stars, which again is ridiculous, as indeed had been previously discovered with a 3-foot telescope. But he did say it is seen with 560 power that the exterior or outside stars, instead of being uniformly distributed like M13, were condensed into a ring. So he did see a ring, which actually probably means on the outside he did basically see a spiral arm, but kind of ignored it or didn't interpret it as a spiral arm. And James South also reported about that night and said it was one of the finest I ever saw in Ireland, and many were seen for the first time since their creation as groups or clusters of stars. And the most popular of the night was 51 of Messier's catalog, M51, which was resolved into stars. Okay, which complete misinterpretation. And the 94th, M94, which was resolved into a larger globular cluster. Okay, well, no, M94 is a galaxy also. So they really got it wrong. Spiral structure was not noticed, but they thought they resolved the galaxies. Why? Well, we'll learn in the next couple of slides. So why was it missed? Well, first of all, I have to just mention in the backdrop, during the 19th century, Kant and Laplace had presented a nebular hypothesis which claimed the existence of a luminous gas or fluid, nebulous matter, which under the action of spinning and contracting by gravity formed planets, stars, clusters, and William Herschel flipped his opinion, as I said, a couple of times on this. Eventually, he supported the nebular hypothesis because NGC 1514 looked like it could not be resolved. It just looked completely like a luminous fluid. But one of Lord Ross's friends, the Reverend Romney Robinson, with his religious perspective, he was adamantly opposed to the nebular hypothesis, because and he felt like Lord Ross's reflector, the Leviathan, was the ultimate weapon that could disprove the nebular hypothesis, and we'll sort of see why. Why would he disprove it? Because if objects are spinning and contracting currently into planets, stars, clusters, etc., that implies there's constant change in the universe, and he subscribed to the belief that the universe was created, and everything was created, of course, in 7 days, and or 6 days, and then there wasn't all of this activity going on currently. Okay, let's go on. So, Robinson came out and just claimed no real nebula has all of these objects appear to be clusters of stars, and they all prove that the nebular hypothesis is false. And let's see, go on. I think there's another quote. Okay, and he was kind of the ideological leader of the group, and he was probably responsible for picking the eyepieces. And how do you observe? What's the best way of observing a globular cluster? Is to resolve a globular cluster. The best way to do that is to use an eyepiece that'll give you a high magnification that'll resolve the individual stars and blow the cluster up. And so likely when he took a view of M51, the first thing he wanted to do was put in a short focal length eyepiece at high magnification to see if he could resolve the center of M51. He wasn't interested in using the lowest possible the longest possible focal length eyepiece they had, because that would not help resolve the cluster. So he probably switched to a higher magnification and argued, look, it's resolved into stars. You guys can see that, right? And everybody else got in line, got up there. Okay, yeah, I guess I see stars. They didn't want to disagree with him, but who knows? I have a feeling they did not all see stars in the center of M51. Okay. So, what happens? Well, Lord Ross goes back up to the telescope, I think a month later, new moon probably, could have been around April 6th. He only could observe it when it was on the meridian, because the telescope, even though it did move a little bit horizontally back and forth, it had a very limited amount of motion, but he had to observe it near the meridian, so it was probably about 1 a.m. when he went back up to take a look. And now he doesn't have Romney Robinson with him, so he's free to use whatever magnification he wants. And go ahead. So he observes alone. He probably uses different powers. He's a little more experienced from using the telescope. Romney Robinson doesn't dominate the telescope and say, we have to look at it at 1,000 power to see if we can resolve the core. And the result is M51 is not a cluster. It's some kind of completely new object that has spiral arms or spiral structure. And Lord Ross said, made the quote afterwards, when certain phenomena can only be seen with great difficulty, the eye may imperceptibly be, in some degree, influenced by the mind. And he's sort of saying they were probably influenced to see the stars in M51 where there were none. Oh, by the way, let's go back one. This is here's some workers with the, I put that in there because, I don't know, I think I was talking to you, Alan, about seeing the mirror, Ross's 72-inch mirror. They're kind of proudly showing it off there by it, which is, well, it makes sense. It's 6 feet tall. I assume you can kind of see the human scale next to the mirror. But I did see the mirror. It's actually at the London Science Museum, and it's on display there. You can see it. Not the telescope, just the mirror. Yeah.
Do we have any indication whether they knew to try and grind parabolas, or whether they were able to? Or were these all spherical, do we think?
Well, I believe Herschel made parabolic mirrors. They were parabolic. They were not. Now, are you saying that because, like, Herschel's 48-inch was f10, and at f10 there's not much difference between a sphere and a parabola? That is true, but still, I think he strove to make a perfect mirror, and he was an excellent mirror maker.
But my recollection was that they tarnished really quickly.
Yeah, they did tarnish.
They had to be refigured.
Not only that, they had to be refigured each time, and they had to have more than one mirror, of course. So they take one mirror out, put the other. They're always repolishing, refiguring a mirror, and putting the one that's finished back in the tube. So here you go. Here is the actual preliminary sketch. This was never really published, but this is Lord Ross's preliminary sketch of M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy. It's a pretty amazing sketch, considering he never saw a photograph of it, and it is of photographic quality. Here's the companion, sometimes called M51B, or has an NGC number. Okay, and this is actually, he presented his drawing of M51 a couple of months later to the 15th annual meeting of the British Association in Cambridge, England, and it so happened that John Herschel was the president of the British Association, and this was the actual sketch that he passed around at everybody at the table to see what M51 really looked like in a big telescope. And this was his sort of a composite sketch from several nights of viewing it. Still a beautiful sketch. Okay. This is the first actual printed reproduction of the sketch in a book, 1846, by John Pringle Nichol. Let's go ahead. And there were other drawings by other observers. Go ahead. There's two more. Great. So other observers in the next, in 1848, 2 years later, made their own renditions of what M51 looked like, and they're all pretty fantastic drawings. The middle one was actually done by Lord Ross in 1848. This one's a little more, I don't know, I guess you'd call it stylist. It's a little stylized as opposed to realistic. And the first one shows quite a bit of detail. I don't know why it looks so off-center, though, but okay. Other observers with three of them, with other telescopes in the 1860s also drew M51. So William Lassell built a 48-inch equatorial reflector. It was a fork-mounted equatorial reflector that was hand-powered, the equatorial mount by a worker who turned a crank, and 48-inch on Malta, and produced these two sketches, the first two, of M51 with his telescope. And this one is the first sketch with a silvered glass mirror, 31-inch, the same one that Stefan used to discover Stephan's quintet and lots of other galaxies. That's another interesting drawing of M51. Okay. So after M51 was discovered, that wasn't the end of the story. At Burr Castle, they continued discovering spiral galaxies. This is the second spiral that was discovered just in 1846, like the following year, and that's M99, and that's the sketch of it. Okay. Here's a sketch of M33. Here's the actual sketch that was published. I labeled 1, 2, 3, 4 little splotches that were drawn, and it turns out those are H2 knots. Those are star-forming regions in M33. The first one, which is the brightest, NGC 604, is actually a pretty easy object, and it was discovered by William Herschel. The other ones were discovered by Lord Rosse, but he never published positions, so no one really knew exactly where they were. So he didn't really get credit for the discovery, because he just did the sketch without having any coordinates. Okay, the next one, that, believe it or not, is M101 in the 72-inch. And there's all kinds of knots in the arms. And this time, all of them have NGC numbers, 5462, 5461, etc. I put arrows by all the various knots in the galaxy. Those are all star-forming regions where there's lots of young stars being born. Okay. Eventually, Ross discovered and his assistants discovered, well, they claim they discovered 67 spirals. This is a list of all of them. These are the NGC numbers. And this is a sample page of their discoveries, which had several spirals on it. But they did make a few mistakes. The objects that they claimed were spirals, and it turned out they were either they were galaxies that weren't spirals, or they were some other type of object. But they discovered dozens of spirals with the 72-inch. Okay. A few spirals were discovered by other observers. This is the first one that was discovered to be a spiral. William Lassell discovered that's his 48-inch, by the way, equatorial fork-mounted telescope. The observers up here. This thing, you can see the platform. It's pretty impressive. And he discovered that M83 was a spiral, and that's his sketch from 1862. I think I wrote an article in Sky and Tel on M83, as a matter of fact, and I reproduced that sketch of his. Okay. So let's get back to M51 for a minute. Lord Rosse, even though they had such trouble seeing that it was spiral initially, he said, "This nebula has been seen by a great many visitors, and its general resemblance to the sketch that I showed you before, that he presented to the British Society, is at once recognized even by unpracticed eyes." In other words, anyone going up to the telescope immediately can see it's a spiral. Well, that wasn't the case with 3 experienced observers initially, but afterwards, once they knew it was a spiral, then they could point it out to rank amateurs. They would come up there and say, "Oh yeah, I see the spiral, it's beautiful." And even, do you remember I showed a picture of 2 15-inch refractors? And they never mentioned ever seeing a spiral anywhere. After it was discovered to be a spiral, they both published, "Oh yeah, it's a spiral. We see it in our telescopes." So once they knew it was a spiral, they could do it. They could see it. Of course. And I added this, since Howard was going to be the speaker, this is his sketch of M51, or one of his sketches that I got, I think, from his website, with his former 28-inch reflector that he's had at this star party many times. And this was, I think, the original copy. It didn't reproduce very well, but it even has more detail in the original one. But that's Howard's sketch. Okay. Okay. I just want to check. I do have examples of a few spirals, but that's really the end of my discussion about M51. So I sort of feel like this might be a good time to close the talk and see if there's any questions. Yeah?
This would be a good, you could title this Examples of Confirmation Bias.
Yes, exactly. And of course, anytime, whoever's the first to discover or the first one to see any deep sky object, probably visually, there's always, you can guarantee someone's going to come along with a smaller telescope and claim they saw it first, or they saw it, in an even smaller telescope. Of course, they would have never found it in the first place if somebody else hadn't done it first. Yeah, any questions about the history or anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned that in one of the telescopes, someone had one of the helpers turn the telescope, turn the mirror.
Not turn the mirror, turn the turn the gear for the equatorial mount. In other words, it did not have a motor. It was human motored.
See, one of the fun things you can try in terms of this whole confirmation bias thing is go look at the wild duck cluster.
Right.
Only whisper to somebody or have somebody whisper, say it's the Borg cluster. And from thereafter you will see it as a Borg cube in space. Only after somebody has told you that. Every time after you'll see it's that.
Do you want to?
Try it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Steve, are there any remnants of the observatories left on Nebraska states in the states?
Yeah, more dry.
You can speak to that.
Well, maybe Alan can speak just briefly about visiting Burkastle.
Yeah, I can say that I unfortunately was not there, but I belong to a group called the Antique Telescope Society, and they did pay a visit. And the overwhelming impression is the pictures kind of convey how massive this telescope is, but everybody was just in awe and staggered by how enormous this instrument was. So they were overwhelmed, and I think it was the 7th Earl of Ross, who still owns the estate, was very gracious and invited our whole group to come have dinner with him and Lady Ross in the castle, and it was one of the highlights of the whole trip. And so I presume, I haven't checked recently, but I think you can still hopefully visit it, but I don't have a recent update.
Right. Yeah, I mean, none of those, the Herschel's telescopes, for example, 18th century telescopes were no longer intact. Though I seem to recall outside, I could be wrong, but outside the Greenwich Observatory in England, they had part of his 48-inch, I forget, some part of the base of it or something on display there, as I recall. But not the actual structure, of course, had all rotten and is destroyed. Anything else? Okay.
So we got the morphology worked out.
Yeah.
So what did they actually think these things were?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, really, up until this is now, of course, we're talking. How late did I go? Maybe 1870s, even 1880s, but it really wasn't, demonstrated that these objects were definitively outside the Milky Way until the late 1920s. So I mean, it's only been 100 years that there is been definite proof, literally 100 years, that there's been definitive proof that external galaxies exist. I mean, there were some astronomers that, as you know, who still clung to the fact that the Milky Way was large enough to encompass, Harlow Shapley, the Milky Way was large enough to encompass everything we see in the telescopes. So it's a relatively even though, as far as we've come, it's all been done relatively recently.
I have a question. I think I read somewhere, or maybe heard from Howard or something, that even if you look at his sketch, there are star-like knots in the core of M51, and I believe they are superstar clusters.
Well, we have seen that in Jimmy's scope.
Okay, maybe that's where I remember it from. But is that what they thought was the result?
I guess that is possible. They saw some graininess. Yes, it is possible they saw some kind of modeling. I think they didn't see stars, but they probably did see some modeling and interpreted that as stars. You know, they didn't think of maybe they were star clusters because they were almost stellar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, Steve, I just wanted to add one thing.
Oh, yeah.
Because you had asked.
Alan?
So what you see, if you go now, you can see the reconstructed tube. So, but the original walls are still there.
The walls are there.
The walls are there. And then
Yeah.
I think to your other point, I think it was Hubble's first major discovery to show that, the nebula are actually outside our galaxy.
Right, exactly. That was
The
Hubble's.
safety of variables, that gives the truth.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I was going to get to Cephids in one of the spirals, but in any case, thank you very much for listening.